beaver ponds are used by like a litany of fish and aquatic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, which in turn support other communities. So there's plenty of other birds and mammals, which then kind of piggyback off of those cascading effects from beaver ponds.
Welcome. I'm the University of Maryland Extension Wildlife Management Specialist. My name is Luke McCauley. We provide speaker series every month on a variety of wildlife topics. But today's speaker is Joshua Tabora. I'm very excited to have Joshua. He's gotten to know Joshua over the last 4 or 5 years. And he is the wildlife biologist for a wildlife biologist for Maryland Wildlife and Heritage Service. And he's worked with DNR since 2015. He got his bachelor's degree in wildlife management at Frostburg State University. They've got a great wildlife program there. And he currently serves as the president of the Maryland Delaware chapter of the Wildlife Society. If anybody wants to learn more about wildlife, that's a great group to get involved with. Josh is originally from Montgomery County, but he lives out in Western Maryland now for the last 12 years. He prefers to spend his time fixing old cars and poring over the public lands of the Ridge and Valley out west. So with that, I will say thank you all for joining. I'll let you take it away, Joshua. Thank you so much for joining us.
Luke, I really appreciate the introduction. As you mentioned, I'm going to talk about beavers in Maryland today, their life history, their state in 2025, and kind of some coexisting strategies, especially in the context of like a settled, developed landscape. So I won't spend too much time on myself. Like Luke said, my name's Joshua Tabora. I'm native to Maryland. You know, I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in Central Maryland, where I'm no doubt a lot of you are calling in from. But I've lived in Allegheny or Garrett County between those two for the last 12 years. I started working with the Department of Natural Resources as a seasonal ranger for the Maryland Park Service, in 2015, and I've been with the DNR since that time. I live in Allegheny County. I support the rest of our game mammal section and natural heritage, the Natural Heritage Project to some extent. But the remainder of the presentation is going to be on beavers and kind of like the mission of the Wildlife and Heritage Service. So if anybody out there is unfamiliar, Maryland Wildlife and Heritage is nestled within the Department of Natural Resources, and it houses all the biologists and the educators and the professionals that manage and research the wildlife species in Maryland. So that includes some of our game species that support hunting and trapping seasons. I have a canvasback and a black bear on the screen here, but it also includes Maryland's rare, threatened, and endangered species, as well as a lot of plants and non-game animals as well. So that's your, for example, like your Delmarva fox squirrel that's endemic to Eastern Shore in the center of that slide. But kind of before we go on, I want to introduce one more topic, which is kind of what my program and what my title revolves around, which is the Fur Bear Project and Fur Bear Biology. So if anybody's unfamiliar, this is the way that you'd say fur bearer. It's pronounced like kind of like pallbearer, but it's an interesting term that has some pretty, I guess, far-reaching kind of ramifications for this talk. So it's important to talk about what a fur bearer is, I think, to understand my role for the department, as well as kind of add some more context to our discussion about beavers starting in just a bit. So no doubt some of you are familiar with this already, but a fur bearer it's a cultural construct, right? So it's not this taxonomic distinction. It describes mammals, which by and large support hunting and trapping seasons, that support or has supported historically, in some cases, a trade in their valuable fur or hair. The component that unites all these animals, despite them being pretty unrelated, is that they're all medium-sized mammals that have valuable hides, right? So a lot of these species are polarizing. Some of them might be kind of considered like a de facto nuisance species to some. So including animals like raccoon, striped skunk, red fox, and our beaver, but also something like Virginia possums, for instance, or bobcats. So there are 14 species of fur bearer in Maryland that my project researches and manages. And beavers are regarded by some as kind of like this ecological linchpin. So we'll spend the rest of our time talking about them. One thing that I want to urge you to consider kind of as we go through this presentation is this idea of carrying capacity, right? So carrying capacity is the number of animals that a given piece of habitat can support based on limited resources like food, water, shelter, cover, and space. Cultural carrying capacity adds an additional component to that, and that's human tolerance and human patience. So as I mentioned, those biotic systems have kind of these prescribed carrying capacities that vary from year to year based on any number of factors. But when you throw this concept of cultural carrying capacity in, it's kind of where people like Luke and myself get folded into the equation. If Luke's a wildlife management specialist, and I'm a wildlife biologist. So one of our biggest roles is managing and researching populations in order to regulate and manage them in such a way that it also keeps them kind of in line and in keeping with cultural expectations. So without further ado, with maybe a little bit longer of a preamble than we needed, we can start talking about our quarry today, which is North American beaver, Castor canadensis. They're captivating. They're multifaceted animals, and they have fascinating life histories. So beavers are the largest fur bearer in Maryland. They average somewhere between like 25 and 40 pounds, perhaps a little bit more than that at reproductive maturity. But exceptional beavers can exceed 75 or 80 pounds in size. And I think the record beaver that I've ever known to have been put on a scale, and this isn't in Maryland, but I think in the northern United States is in the 100-pound range. So quite large animals that they can be at maturity in the right circumstances. Beavers have a single litter per year, with the females coming into estrus in midwinter, so like around the middle of January, and after a fairly lengthy gestation of about 100 to 110 days, 2 to 5 kits are born in May or early June inside of the lodge. So at birth, the kits possess fully developed teeth and are very well furred, kind of folding in with their mostly aquatic lifestyle. At 2 to 3 weeks of age, the kits can begin to eat vegetation, which is pretty early for mammal development. And they're weaned by about 6 weeks. So again, early in the general scheme of things for mammals, but you tend to see this with a lot of semi-aquatic or fully aquatic fur bearers, or just mammal species in general. They tend to have kind of this accelerated growth due to the need to integrate into that kind of aquatic system. The young will remain with the adults as a family group or a colony until their second year of age, where they will disperse to find a home range of their own. One thing that is very interesting, and I think endears beavers to those in the know, is that beavers are monogamous, and they will typically stay together for multiple breeding seasons at a minimum, or life, and they often work cooperatively between the male and the female to raise their young, which again is not necessarily a standard in the mammalian world. So kind of strong parenting instincts here. They will also have kind of these extended family groups or colonies, like I mentioned before, where the 2-year-old beavers rather, before they disperse. So the young from the previous year will actually help with some of the construction activities and the raising of the kits that are born the year after they are, before they go out to find a home range of their own. If anybody here has ever seen a beaver kit, I mean, it looks just like a miniature beaver, but they're super stinking cute. Beavers, interestingly, because they have enough dexterity and because they're often manipulating sticks and branches and building materials with their forearms. Beavers have the capability to pick up and carry their young. So I wasn't able to find a picture of that on the web. But if you picture it kind of folded in with some of the other stuff I mentioned, it kind of does a pretty good job of, I guess, anthropomorphizing these animals. You know, they do have very, very strong parenting instincts, and they do take kind of unique care of their young. Um, Please go. Oh, interesting. So beavers typically will not, and I think that's a fair question to ask. I guess I had mentioned that they can reach a relatively large size at maturity. In general, safety concerns aren't something that I would be concerned of with beavers. The most typical response that you'll see to a beaver, kind of trying to communicate discomfort, is that they'll surface and they'll slap the water with their flat tail, and that signals to other beavers, whether through like kind of ripples in the water or the sound of that kind of like the tail hitting the water. It's pretty loud, but it signals that there's danger in the area, and all the other animals kind of remain on alert thereafter. Um, Kind of as so it's actually a timely question, because the slide that I'm on, is one where we'll begin to talk about kind of their construction and maintenance activities. One of the reasons why beavers build dams in the first place, it's multifaceted, but one reason why they build it, aside from food storage and transportation, is for security cover. So an animal that's like large and slow moving like a beaver, in order to seek shelter, isn't able to like climb a tree or use like brushy cover, for example. So deep water, that is the creation of like this deep water scape that's facilitated by the building of dams, is actually this a safety mechanism for beavers. So excellent question, very timely. Um, so a lot of a beaver's life history is based around the construction and maintenance of this infrastructure, right? These dams and these lodges. Beavers build different structures depending on their surroundings, and they'll use both constructed lodges and excavated bank dens as their domicile. So depending on the part of the state that you live in, you can see both pretty much anywhere, but especially in parts of Central Maryland and portions of Central Maryland where you have kind of like deep cut banks or something like that. Bank lodges are relatively common. The picture that I have on the left bottom of the slide, I think, is from Montgomery County. I believe it's from Seneca Creek State Park. I think it did come off of the Maryland Biodiversity Project, but it's kind of a hybrid of those two things. So beavers will occasionally just excavate a burrow into the side of a bank if the environment's suitable for it. That allows them to enter and exit the water with ease. Kind of the more typical classical den structure that you think of when you think of a beaver is a lodge. So it's this curated pile of sticks and mud that has multi chambers that allow beavers to groom and then kind of enter their sleeping space or their bedroom, so to speak, dry and relatively free of parasites and mud. So the beaver lodges will be constructed often around reservoirs or shallower bodies of water, or just areas that don't allow excavation pretty well. But they're very durable structures, and they're used by beavers. They can be for multiple generations, and then they're after beaver abandonment by any number of other species. So we'll talk about that in just a bit. So the dams are constructed to stem the flow of water and to create deeper channels. So I mentioned that deep water not only facilitates kind of that security cover, that escape cover, right? It's also used for transport of building materials, for the maintenance of lodges or dams. And it's used as cold storage in the winter. Beavers don't hibernate, and most of what they eat in the summer is submerged aquatic vegetation or tubers from cattails, rhizomes from like semi-aquatic plants and things like that. They obviously eat woody vegetation throughout the year, but during the winter, that's what they're relying on because there's not so much of that submerged aquatic vegetation or the leafy greens on the shore. So the way that they prepare for that is by preparing a cache of, I guess, green clippings of things like willow, dogwood, aspen, and other hardwood species like fruit trees, cherry, birch, what have you, growing close to the water. They'll take the smaller stems and they will stash them in a portion of deep water adjacent to their lodges. That helps to regulate the temperature and keep those green stems fresh for longer. So in addition to that escape cover and transportation, you have their ponds acting as food storage as well, which I think is pretty cool. So all this infrastructure obviously serves the beavers' livelihoods, and it is, it's primarily constructed for the beavers' life history and for their protection. But it has these wide-reaching effects across the ecosystem. So that infrastructure greatly benefits a number of other species. Beaver ponds are used by like a litany of fish and aquatic invertebrates, macroinvertebrates, which in turn support other communities. So there's plenty of other birds and mammals, which then kind of piggyback off of those cascading effects from beaver ponds. There are several species of dragonfly specifically that associate very closely with beaver ponds, because if you think of a beaver pond, it's essentially water that's built in by the sieve that has that drains water very slowly. So beaver ponds are porous, and they create this microhabitat where you have very, very slowly moving water with some accumulated sediment, but also like hard gravel or like a harder bottom in portions that also has a relatively steady temperature. So for those reasons, there are a handful of species that associate very, very closely with that microclimate. Hydrated soils adjacent to beaver ponds also support shorebirds and unique plant communities. Waterfowl, which are very cultural and economic important in the state of Maryland, will commonly use beaver ponds either as nesting or brood rearing habitat. So I have a picture of a wood duck drake on the bottom right here. That's one of those species that very closely associates with beaver related habitat. Even once beaver structures are abandoned, they will continue to be used by other wildlife species, such as muskrats and river otters will commonly use abandoned beaver lodges. When the dams themselves are abandoned or fall into disrepair, if you think about that sediment that gets caught in a beaver dam, that trapped nutrient silt layer and can kind of is very quickly colonized by terrestrial vegetation as the water recedes and drains. So it can create something kind of like a pseudo meadow habitat on either side of the stream channel, which is very, very high quality early successional habitat, and that can support anything from white-tailed deer to grouse in some parts of the state, woodcock in many parts of the state. And some other early successional bird species, such as like field sparrows or indigo buntings, will also use kind of openings like that created on either sides of the riparian channel. So a lot of spillover effects across the ecosystem and across other. Sorry, folks, I skipped a couple slides here. A lot of spillover effects across the ecosystem. So I have a couple examples here of some beaver influenced habitat. On the right, you can see a beaver pond. I took that picture about 2 weeks ago in Prince George's County. But there's an abandoned beaver pond where the banks have already receded, and you can kind of start to see that successional recolonization that I was referring to earlier, where you have cattails and you have water tolerant grasses kind of coming in along the edges, and then you'd expect woody vegetation to recolonize next. And that's all important for any number of different wildlife and plant species. On the left here, you can see a musclewood or ironwood stem that was cut by beavers, and you can see what is called epicormic regeneration, or stump sprouting as it's colloquially known. So those stump sprouts can be important browse for white-tailed deer and other ungulates. It's exceptionally high in mineral content because the root structure that was supporting a larger tree is now going into regenerating a higher stem density, but a relatively small amount of woody stems in the first few years of regrowth. So it's very nutritious. But if you think of a beaver clipping, anywhere from 20 or 10% to, upwards of 60% of the stems within a certain radius of a stream channel, the effects of that kind of habitat change then become more apparent. So when you have a lot of this regenerating stump sprouting, it creates a denser form of cover, which benefits, again, a lot of wildlife species, ground nesting birds, small game species like rabbits, and any other number of species that require more stems and more cover close to the ground in order to evade predators. So one thing that's helpful to keep in mind when you're thinking of beavers' distribution throughout the state is that Maryland is really diverse geographically, right? So starting west and working towards the ocean, we have the Appalachian Plateau, which is shaded brown on this map. It's relatively rich with water resources, and portions of it actually drain not to the Chesapeake Bay, but to the Mississippi watershed. So everything in the Yacht would drain westward rather than eastward to the bay, which is kind of crazy to think about. So you do have a moderately dense beaver population there. The two zones in the east, which is two zones immediately east of the Ridge and Valley and then the Blue Ridge, which is in red and purple, are relatively water poor. So they do have stream channels. They're bounded to the south by the Potomac River. And they also support beaver populations where the habitat is suitable. But in general, you think of this as lower density habitat. Moving all the way east in the state, or I guess central Maryland, where you're into the Piedmont, you're into tillable soils. So counties like portions of Frederick, Montgomery County, Howard, Carroll, Baltimore, you start seeing larger river systems again. So things like the Monocacy, the Conococheague is one, I guess, in the Ridge and Valley that I failed to mention. But the Monocacy portions of the Potomac, and then some of your larger semi-tidal systems like the Susquehanna support robust beaver populations. And then finally, once you get into the coastal plain represented by the green and the yellow shading layers, you get into areas where you have multi-thread channels. Your creeks start opening up and getting really, really wide. That is excellent beaver habitat, especially I would think many portions of Anne Arundel County kind of typologize when I'm referring to where you have kind of this matrix of multi-stem river channels and creeks, along with like hardwood buffers on the edges that create this really, really excellent beaver habitat, and relatively dense, abundant populations of beavers. If you think about where most of the people in the state of Maryland live, it is within the former two areas that I described, the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And I have this slide up briefly just to kind of highlight the degree to which coexistence and cultural tolerance is necessary for healthy beaver populations in the landscape. Rampant development around the nation's capital in the transportation infrastructure to support all those people. 8 million people spread across the state of Maryland. Most of those living in central Maryland and some parts of the coastal plain. Elsewhere, habitat is highly modified or exclusive to beavers due to development, agriculture, and infrastructural interests. And the amount of road, roof, and other impermeable surfaces necessary to maintain that population also increases the time of concentration for these channels and really kind of changes the characteristics, at least when compared to the stream channels on a historic basis of a lot of the water systems in that part of the state. So that, along with decreases in groundwater recharge times, and increased sediment loads, nutrient loads coming into the bay, kind of conspire to radically reduce water quality. That threatens a lot of livelihoods. It threatens the ecosystems that rely on it, and an entire cultural landscape. So, in some ways, beavers can be a solution to that on a larger level. If we have a little bit more landscape tolerance, and that's what we're going to spend most like the remainder of the presentation on. I'm sorry, folks. The question that's operative here is that, in a state that's as densely populated as Maryland, how do wildlife professionals like Luke and myself, how do we mitigate and kind of manage those conflicts between human and wildlife, and particularly something that can be as transformative but as destructive as a beaver? That they have excellent ecosystem effects, but it does not come without detractors or some forms of economic harm. So I talked about time of concentration, groundwater recharge in the last slide. I think this slide this image does an excellent job of kind of communicating the effects that beavers can have on some of these degraded stream channels. As I mentioned earlier, a beaver dam is not completely watertight. It's semi-porous, so it's catching sediment and it's filtering water throughout. You could see here how the water above the beaver pond is still, it's not moving as fast, and then the stream channel remains moving underneath of it. This kind of does a good job of representing kind of those semi-porous qualities of that beaver pond, and kind of elucidating how it captures sediment and slows the movement of water in order to reduce the negative effects on bay health that we talked about earlier. People are often perturbed by the changes to the footprint of a stream, or kind of the tree felling activities that beavers will engage in order to build those dams. But this kind of typifies some of those effects, some of those positive effects from a human standpoint. One of the things that people can do, or that private property owners or recreational property managers can consider when they're trying to decide whether to or how to coexist with beavers, is the installation of some amount of coexistence infrastructure. So this is called a pond leveler. There are different designs. I do believe this isn't a Clemson pond leveler. It's a semi-newer activity. But essentially the way that it operates is by facilitating drainage with culvert tubing in such a way that doesn't create a vacuum or doesn't create any suction or whirlpool noises. Beavers construct their dams based on the noise that flowing water creates. So they don't know if they can't tell where the water is draining, they won't dam around it. So by protecting one end of a culvert drain, and keeping beavers or sediment from plugging it up, you can facilitate drainage and manage beaver dams at a certain water depth in order to maintain the beaver at that site more or less in perpetuity, but also mitigate the effects of some of that flooding, and perhaps reduce the footprint of land that could be lost to the expansion in beaver dam, or the expansion of like a beaver pond, versus like the stream channel that was there before. It's not.
Hey, Joshua, we've got a couple of questions coming on exactly this topic. So,
okay, yeah, what do you got?
Well, first off, maybe we can back up a little
Please.
bit. Would you say the largest source of conflict is related to beavers damming up areas that you need drainage on, like for roadways or expanding the footprint of a pond beyond what somebody would like? Is that the biggest source of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, you could kind of typify it in a couple different ways. There is some beaver damage is purely aesthetic, right? People just don't like the way it looks, but it's not threatening infrastructure or any economic activities. Then you have kind of like economic harms. So beavers might cut down valuable like landscape trees. They might affect a view shed in such a way that devalues property, or they might cause harm to agriculture. But yes, absolutely. I'd say probably the biggest form of conflict that we see and talk about in Maryland, at least, would be beavers affecting the flow of water through like culverts in such a way that like threatens infrastructure. So bridges and roads can become compromised if you have kind of the right mixture of, I guess, beaver flooding. So definitely a very common form of conflict. That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Hmm. That's a hard one to say. I mean, I pond level or like kind of rainfall would have been like kind of one of my guesses as to why they were doing that. But damming activities are more or less explicitly related to like the sound of the water. So I don't know if I think it would probably be an opposite effect where you'd expect more like evaporative loss during the month of June and kind of less flowing water, less noise. But it's a good question, and it's beavers in general are very very site specific. In kind of with their activities, and it's hard to predict what a beaver will do at one site versus another. So without seeing it, it would be hard for me to guess. But it does seem odd. I don't know. It could be. I would kind of be. I would be surprised. It could be kind of like an instinct to enlarge the footprint that would be meant to enlarge the footprint of the pond in order to increase kind of the carrying capacity for that area. If I had to guess, it's probably stimuli related though. That's just my best guess, and I don't know why it would be different from June to any other month. But yeah, good question. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, so I guess in the situation that you're describing, like a lot of times the outflow is like a standpipe where it's just a pipe that's sticking like vertically up and down in a pond that when the water reaches a certain level, it starts to flow down that standpipe or that drain. And that works to kind of facilitate the level of the pond at like a maximum level. But what that can do is if the pond is regularly at that level, it creates that suction noise, and beavers will flock to it and try to plug it up, um, and that's where you can get some of those issues coming from. Um, so this kind of structure, like a beaver deceiver, as sometimes you call it, or a pond leveler, they're great, but they don't work in every situation, and they're still kind of they're relatively novel to this region. So there's a whole kind of flow chart of different decisions that you can go through about like site characteristics that may be more or less that may make a site more or less, I guess, favorable or conducive to the installation of one of those pond levelers. So not perfect for every site, every culvert, but is often a very effective solution for kind of managing for managing the footprint of beaver activity. Uh, is something else that you can do if, the question was a great one because it kind of made me introduce the different kind of typologies of beaver damage. If the kind of damage that you're trying to prevent is damage to landscape trees or like culturally important trees in a park setting, or newly planted trees or whatever, you can. Caging is often very, very effective. It's often something that I think is overlooked, in part because people will try it without success. But this, like everything else, has kind of its best management practices. So the kind of mesh that you use to construct the cage is pretty important. Using like a 2-inch by 4-inch wire mesh, so something that you could reliably get at a farm and garden store, is going to be superior to either hardware cloth or chicken wire for a number of reasons. Chicken wire isn't very durable and it's not very rigid. So it either needs to be kind of stretched with staking, which takes more time, and it's likely to rust anyway. And then hardware cloth is just very, very visible, and it's more expensive for the area, for the square footage. Another important component of this is the height. So beavers, like I described earlier in the presentation, can get deceivingly tall. So caging a tree at 4 feet is kind of your best practice, because something that's 2.5 or even 3 feet, beavers can often stand over or pull down. You have to keep in mind beavers are relatively strong. They carry or drag logs a fair ways to water sometimes. So beavers will try to muscle around this, but building something that's rigid and tall enough is often effective at protecting, select numbers of landscape trees. And this is something that can go up relatively quickly. And then one of the last things that you want to consider is is welfare for the tree itself. Just leaving enough room for growth, anticipating future growth, so that you're not girdling these trees that you're trying to protect. Something else, kind of maybe a little bit more in the aesthetic range, is sand painting. So you can actually go out and purchase, any exterior latex paint, and then mix in sand on the stated ratios on the slide. And if you're interested in more information, that QR code will take you to the page that describes some of these techniques for both sand painting and caging. Neither of these things are 100% effective, but they can be vastly effective, depending on just how closely you adhere to these recommendations. What sand painting does is it creates this kind of layer of grit surrounding the tree. And beavers have self-sharpening and ever-growing teeth, so their teeth are resistant to wear. But in general, they try to keep them sharp and maintain them, so they don't like to chew through gritty bark. So when they hit that stand, it can often deter them. And so this is nice because you can color match the color of your paint to common trees in your area, or even on a tree by tree basis if you're feeling really artistic or really, really particular about the visual impact on the landscape. So in a park setting or in a curated, residential setting, this potentially something that you could use that isn't going to have kind of that visual footprint that caging would. So once again, not 100% effective, but highly effective in the right circumstances at preventing some of that damage. So this is a little bit of that preventative maintenance. We do have, we're fortunate enough to have, a nonprofit in this region that actually kind of specializes in facilitating human beaver coexistence. So this QR code will take you to the Human Beaver Coexistence Fund site. These folks are a relatively, I guess I can't even call them new at this point. I'd say they're like 6 or 7 years old. But they support a number of programs that I think are pretty forward thinking, or pretty cutting edge, I guess you'd say. At one point in time, they had a pilot project that was actually paying farmers and landowners rent on the flooded acres that beavers provided, if the landowner agreed to maintain the beaver for a period of 3 years. So that they were just pledging not to remove the animal for that period of time. But they also offer a couple other resources. And they can connect you to, I guess, some of the right resources in your area in the Maryland and Northern Virginia region. So an excellent resource, again, hit that QR code or just do a Google search for the Human Beaver Coexistence Fund, and you'll find more information on it. One of the last things that I want to talk about as we wrap this presentation, and when we're considering culture, care, and capacity and coexistence, is the existence and the practice of beaver trapping or beaver harvest. Coexistence strategies are often suggested, as a first resort or something, as an option. Oftentimes, this may be undesirable or impractical if a homeowner entity, is unwilling or unable to afford the costs of like the installation for one of those flow devices, or if you're at a site where it doesn't work. If agriculture, economic, or infrastructural interests are threatened, and it's something that's critical, trapping may be necessary. So, outside of the regulated trapping season, landowners and private individuals can hire nuisance cooperators that are licensed by the Department of Natural Resources in order to remove beavers humanely. If you want a link to that directory where you could find people that are active doing this work in your area, that QR code will take you to our nuisance wildlife cooperator directory. Landowners can choose to do some of that work themselves if they receive special permits and they know what they're doing. But the third and last option is actually, I think, one of the most favorable, and that's the regulated recreational trapping season on beavers. So if we return to one of the things that we talked about in the first couple slides, which is cultural carrying capacity, our landscape, if it was undeveloped and even in its present state, could support more beavers than it does now. One of the biggest barriers to, having expanded beaver populations or more beavers on the landscape doing more of that work is just a lack of human tolerance for them at some sites. Some of that's preventable and some of it isn't. But our licensed fur trappers are educated and taking part in an activity that has a lot of residuals for private property owners and for the ecosystem by maintaining some of those populations at their cultural carrying capacity levels. From reporting mechanisms such as post-season harvest surveys, we determine our beaver take and monitor our regulated trapping season. And biologists like myself do this for all of our hunting and trapping seasons, and we're certain and confident that no unintentional population harm is coming to these species, and that populations are not becoming threatened or endangered from modern regulated trapping. Now, talking about trapping as a tool to manage beaver populations. I think trapping often invokes a primitive or an outdated, I guess you'd say, kind of imagery. But one thing that I think I'd like to leave you all with is that trapping in the modern day is actually highly regulated and highly researched. It's enforced by trained conservation professionals through bag limits and set seasons, and they're dedicated law enforcement officers whose sole duty it is to enforce natural resources code. Because of that careful planning, because of the scientific based seasons, and because of that research, modern hunting and trapping seasons do not cause unintended population declines or cause species to become endangered, like some of the unregulated and uncontrolled trapping that happened in the United States and North America, and in the 16th through the 20th century. That no longer happens today, and because of that, we have robust wildlife populations and a robust, healthy population of beavers in Maryland. But with that being said, I think I would like to leave the rest of the presentation open to questions about beavers themselves. So my last slide is a QR code. I think that QR takes you to my LinkedIn. If you have any questions that maybe I don't get to at the end of the call, please feel free to send me an email, give me a call. I would be happy to talk about that more. But Luke, we can go ahead and move into any questions in the chat that linger.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Joshua. That was awesome. I know we've had a few questions. It's interesting. It does seem like they are a polarizing animal, and a lot of people are like, "How do we get beavers?" And a lot of people are, "How do I get rid of these beavers?" And we've got to think both of those folks here on the line. One question, Tom, I think Ed asked about earlier. Will they eat Phragmites?
That's a real good one. We actually have native forms of Phragmites that some of these animals are co-evolved with. I know of evidence of muskrats eating Phragmites. I don't think that a beaver would probably ignore a resource that's that abundant in some of their habitat. I think maybe just as a consequence of how ubiquitous Phragmites is, it may be part of their diet, whereas it wouldn't be previously. But honestly, that's speculation on my part, Luke. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's an excellent
one. It certainly doesn't seem like they are stopping the invasion of that species.
Certainly not.
They're not going to make a dent in it spreading, unfortunately, it seems. I have seen beavers. I'll be curious to hear just examples of other feed resources you've seen them use. I have seen them gnaw on tulip poplar trunks. I have seen them gnaw on spice bush stems and trunks. Probably some oaks. I'm curious if you've seen some favorite preferences for certain types of trees or other things like that.
Totally. So in your coastal plain environment, like a lot of the hardwoods there are fair game. Sweet gum can be a favorite, especially when it's present in like healthy numbers. Sweet gum's absolutely something that they favor. Maples, like red maple, is actually, it's softer than sugar maple or hard maple. You don't have a ton of sugar maple on the shore anyway, I suppose, but black gum as well. I've seen them chew holly. They definitely chew softwood. They definitely, I've seen them strip the bark off of softwood, but oftentimes they'll go with those hardwood species before, I think just as kind of a general preference. Anything fruit producing, so anything like Rosaceae, like plum, cherry, apple, pear, are strong favorites. Kind of for the same reason that people use them for smoking barbecue or whatever. They're a little bit more aromatic, and I think they're probably sweeter, higher sugar content, things like that. But all the stuff that you mentioned, absolutely. Oaks, hickories, in some cases. Tulip poplar is another one, because of how fast tulip poplar regenerate. Some of those smaller polewood stage poplar stems closer to the water will be they're prime targets for beaver chewing. Absolutely.
Right. Little piece of trivia. I learned the source of the word of sweet gum because a beaver had girdled one and killed it in my backyard, and it had all this sap, and I was touching the sap and smelled the sap, and I was like, oh, this is probably where it gets its name. Do you find any coexistence issues between wildlife? Ed had asked about river otters. I would think that there might be some positive symbiotic relationships with the river otters, but I don't know if you know anything about whether they would displace each other or facilitate each other.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned earlier, river otters will use abandoned beaver lodges. Unlike beavers, river otters they're not monogamous. Pretty much the only role that the males play is fertilizing and impregnating the female. And the females will actually kind of seclude themselves in the upper reaches, or the headwaters. Maybe not so much the headwaters, but narrower portions of stream channels when they're raising their kits and before their kits are really more mobile and able to like navigate larger river systems. So conceivably, you could have beavers will often form kind of like a community where they will they'll set up shop really close to like a previously abandoned or a previously built dam or whatever, and they'll kind of create this series of step pools. So they may not be maintaining them all at the same time, but they'll kind of leapfrog between them in order to kind of spread their use of resources amongst like across a larger area. So it kind of that network can definitely host river otters. Otters will prey on small beavers because otters can reach a fair size as well. I mean, males can exceed like 25 pounds, definitely large enough to take a small beaver. But once they're at maturity, they're probably not. They're not. They're just not frisky enough to take down, a 50 or 60-pound beaver. So I would say like a net from the standpoint of the beavers, they're creating enough habitat. They're just creating more aquatic habitat, which is what otters need. So definitely something that overall benefits otters.
Tom mentioned he can show you an area on the eastern shore that looks like it was bombed because of a beaver damming up the area, and they can open up the tree canopy, right?
They absolutely can. They absolutely can.
Yeah, Ed mentioned also, his solution to the beavers damming up that area where the water was flowing, his solution was to raise the gate at night to stop their construction, then lower the gate in the morning to let water out of the pond while they were sleeping, so to avoid that sound of water. Cool. Lou had asked, is there a regional beaver population effort in Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania? And I suspect that might be related to reintroductions. I do know some people do want to try and get beavers on their property when they're not there. What are their options? Is there any sort of legal ways in which you could get beavers?
So repeat the first part of the question for
Lou
me.
would ask, is there a regional beaver population effort? And I'm not sure, Lou, feel free to elaborate if you're just interested in, is there research going on?
So I'm pretty sure I understand what he's asking. So Lou, beavers were reintroduced into the eastern United States, I think, in the 50s and 60s. To some degree, I don't think beavers were ever reintroduced into any parts in Maryland, any portions of Maryland. It's my understanding that beavers naturally colonized the eastern shore from pre-existing populations on the mainland. And the necessity of, I guess, like kind of like stocking or reintroducing beavers in the East it's just not as valid anymore as you might think. Maryland has enough water, especially in central Maryland and eastern Maryland, that it's pretty hard to go anywhere that doesn't have salt in it without finding beaver sign within like a quarter to a half of a mile. Most of the habitat that can support beavers already has beavers. And what, like I mentioned, plenty of points in the presentation, one of the biggest barriers to beavers colonizing more of a vacant habitat is just human tolerance. If you are a property owner that would like to host beavers, that wants to figure out how to get them, I think honestly the best thing that I can suggest you do is just wait. If your site, whether it's a stream or a pond, can facilitate beaver habitation, I would pretty much guarantee that you are within half to 3/4 of a mile of an existing beaver colony, whether you realize it or not. I don't think there's any kind of riparian area in Maryland that isn't within like the dispersal range of an existing beaver colony. Again, like one of the biggest barriers is just that tolerance component. A lot of the vacant habitat that's good habitat that doesn't have beavers is just a place where either beavers can't be because of human interest or where beavers aren't tolerated, for aesthetic reasons. Barring that, it is not illegal. for beaver to be released from one place to another in Maryland. Beavers aren't a rabies vector species. However, you do need written permission from the place that where you want to release the beaver, and it comes with a litany of problems. Wild animals have minds of their own, and it would be very, very difficult to kind of construct a habitat where you could release a beaver and be guaranteed that the animal would stay there. If the animal is allowed to move on its own volition, it's more than likely going to do so. And if that beaver moves a quarter mile or half a mile down the stream, the parcel sizes of Maryland, the average parcel size just isn't very big. It's hard to have enough property to say that if I release a beaver somewhere, it's going to stay in my spread. So potentially you're releasing beavers onto your neighbors, and that could open you up to litigation if any damage is to occur. So we do kind of caution folks to consider the implications before they encourage beavers to be released on their property. But it is something that it is something that's possible, but there's a lot of caveats to it. In general, perhaps not something I'd recommend.
Yeah. And another thing about beavers too, and that I've noticed in our creek bottom, there were beaver dams there before we moved in, and the neighbors had removed them, I think, to kind of dry out the wetland a bit and be able to drive around and walk around down there. The beavers are still in the creek. I have seen them swimming in the creek, but they have not rebuilt a dam. So I'm sure they are further downstream, probably upstream, but it seems as though once that lodge has been removed, maybe there is maybe a long period of time, years, before they might come back and build a lodge in that same spot again. And you don't know where they're going to build the lodge at, right?
To some extent, that's true, Luke. To some in some cases, it isn't. There are some sites that state highway or like a county roads department will trap beavers out of the same culverts year after year after year. And there's just some characteristics about kind of like the pitch points that a culvert creates or a piece of infrastructure creates where you have deep water on either end that just make it very, very suitable to beaver habitation. So not always easy to predict, but it just depends on the site. But one thing that one kind of those coexistence strategies that we talked about is at a site where you have kind of the recurring cost or inconvenience of trapping beavers and removing, the lodge or the dam. It's one of the things that makes a coexistence device or a flow device seem more appealing. It kind of mitigates some of that upfront cost because you're saving money over the long term. You can potentially save money over the long term versus hiring a nuisance contractor to come every time that you have a threat to the infrastructure. So in some ways, in some cases, that those coexistence devices and strategies can end up saving money long term. Yeah.
Cool. Nita asked, do we have an estimate of the population size of beavers in Maryland and how it's going? Is it going up or down?
That's a great question. So Maryland, as well as most of the other state wildlife agencies, doesn't have a direct count of beavers or most of our wildlife species, right? We have estimates for a handful of like big game species that we have a lot of data on. So we have a good idea of how many deer are in Maryland. And we're in the process of developing a robust estimate for our bear population. But this is something that takes a lot of work and a lot of time to create essentially a census with a robust confidence interval that's very defendable from a scientific standpoint. So in lieu of that, typically what state wildlife agencies will do is estimate densities and or trends with harvest, whether your take on beavers going up or down. Our beaver population is stable to increasing in some parts of the state. Again, I think one of the biggest barriers to to beaver population expansion is just the overall background rate of tolerance being middling or on the low side right now. Our recreational beaver harvest and our nuisance trapper take isn't actually very high for a state that has as much water, as much coast, or as many river systems in it as Maryland. So we definitely believe that the best way to support more beavers on the landscape is to set aside like what left we have of our I guess adequate buffers for development on the undeveloped land that Maryland still has, and just more cultural tolerance. The only state that I'm aware of in the East that has a semi-recent census or projection of their beaver population is North Carolina. But like the Black Bear Research Project that I mentioned earlier, for instance, is taking place over the course of like 3 or 4 years, and is I think projected to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of like above $500,000. So it's something that's deceivingly difficult to create. But again, we from our trend data, from our like our citizen science resources, and just from other indexes, have a very high level of confidence that we have a robust and either stable or growing beaver population in Maryland.
Yeah. Boy, the questions keep coming in. Love it. We covered a few of these. Marika mentioned a story out in the Czech Republic that a dam process had been stalled for permitting, and then the beavers moved in and took care of it. Marika said, in general, do beaver know best? Or put differently, how does one know when to intervene and when to let beaver plans take their course? And I would guess this is maybe one of those cultural carrying capacity.
And that's it. It's just what you're willing to tolerate. If it's on your private property and you're kind of the decision making party. If you can determine that the damages are aesthetic, or it's something that might change the character of your property without harming anything, I'd encourage you to kind of lean on the side of coexistence. That the aquatic habitat that they create is invaluable on the landscape, and in some cases it can create economic benefits for the landowners. I talked briefly about kind of that rent cost program. Beaver habitat's excellent habitat for a lot of other wildlife species. And I actually know a couple cases where landowners have been able to lease waterfowl hunting rights on a series of beaver ponds, like a network of beaver ponds on like kind of a marshy property, where for in excess of $10,000. So those hunting rights are very, very valuable, and that's habitat that would be lower quality or wouldn't exist at all without the animals. So I think that people may look at initial beaver damage and they just might see fallen trees, and they might remember, like a forest that was there prior, or like, they might think of the forest differently. But I think if you're willing to kind of put on, be a little bit more patient and think further down the road, that aquatic habitat, it's extremely high quality, and it can be very, very, it can be a very positive thing to have on a property. So it's all about your preferences and what you're trying to do, and what I guess the harmful or the negative, the cons of having a beaver on that property could do.
Right. Yeah, no, I think one thing I'd echo on that is I feel like the more diversity of structure and of your habitat can bring in more different types of animals.
Absolutely.
And beavers are one of these animals that can open up a small forest opening that gets sunlight down to the ground. We talk a lot about this for bobwhite quail habitat. That sunlight hits the forest floor and you get this explosion of wildflowers, and some of that stuff can be really beneficial for a variety of bird species that rely on those insects that are coming in to pollinate the wildflowers in those openings. So a lot of forage gets produced. I think you mentioned that earlier, the forage for your deer and things when you get sunlight down to the forest
Yeah.
floor.
And not just forage, like very, very high quality forage. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah. And somebody once described wetlands as a sponge. And I think beavers probably do a lot to add a lot of capacity in the sponge of your wetlands.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So had a couple other questions. Paul recommended reading Beaverland by Layla Phillip. I don't know if you're familiar with that book,
Hold
Joshua.
on,
Got it in your back. You got it in your bookshelf right there.
I don't think I have my copy at the office, but I do have a I actually have a signed copy from Layla. I've been fortunate to be able to meet her. It's an excellent book. I think I think the thing that I appreciate about it the most is that she kind of, from the viewpoint of like a neophyte or somebody that isn't perhaps like versed in kind of traditional wildlife management, like you or myself, is kind of wading into this culture of not just like beaver advocacy, but also beaver trapping. And I think she does a really good job of describing the role that like recreational and regulated trapping plays in beaver coexistence and just the broader beaver movement. So I don't think she doesn't construct any adversarial relationships where none exist. So I kind of applaud the book for that, for sure. It's a pretty good read.
Cool. And somebody had, speaking on the population estimation question, and something I just think is a good thing for everybody to think about. We all want to know, how many bear are there? How many beavers are there? And as Josh alluded, it's a very difficult thing to measure. It takes a lot of money and a lot of resources. And then the challenge, I measured deer populations on a ranch out in California for one of my dissertation chapters. By the time we'd compiled all the data and found a population estimate, the population had probably changed. And so years pass and then it's different. And then you got to do another study again. So it's a huge amount of effort to get at it. And that's why we use metrics like trapping rates. And I'm sure DNR, they can calculate how many people have licenses, how many days they're out, and how many beavers they took, given the amount of effort. And so that is as good a proxy as we can get without spending lots of money to try and estimate it. So I think it's best. One of those reasons why we don't have good numbers is just
and that's absolutely correct, Luke. And I think just because they're indexes doesn't mean they're not good. There's some of these sample sizes when you're talking about hours of field, the number. There are roughly, I believe, like somewhere between like 60 and 70,000 licensed hunters in the state of Maryland, and the cumulative hours that they put into that recreational pursuit actually create like a very, very robust kind of sighting index. And on top of that, it's not that we don't want to spend money on these species. It's just that there's only so much in the piggy bank when it comes to conservation. We have to make our decisions sometimes painfully, but very deliberately. Like I mentioned earlier, my project is spread across 14 fur bear species, and then with the addition of small game and a couple oddballs, there's 20 different species of mammals that I'm researching and kind of managing. So we do the best we can with what we have, absolutely, but we feel very confident, that no harm is coming to these populations, absolutely.
Great. Yeah. We had some comments on river otters using old beaver lodges, and that was a pretty cool thing. Beavers don't seem to mind the otters. Ed's asked, do beaver travel overland or is it always along waterways?
That's a cool question. No, they can smell. They actually have a very potent sense of smell because they'll can communicate with each other using like castor mounds or like scent glands. So a lot of that's water dispersed, but beaver can smell water and they can hear moving water. So oftentimes they will move from watershed to watershed over land. The furthest case that I know of a beaver finding like a farm pond from like the nearest body of water that had water in it, like the nearest, I guess, permanent body of water, I should say. There's like little alluvial channels that have water after rainstorms or things like that. But a beaver, like it was a distance of about a mile that this beaver would have had to have traveled from the nearest stream stem where that had water in it. So it's certainly they will travel further than that, though I doubt that's the rule. It's probably the exception in most cases.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's we'll close on
Great
this last question from Pat, and a similar one. Yeah, how far will a beaver travel for sticks to collect sticks and wood? And I've seen something like along the lines of several hundred feet from the water, and it probably is a degrading probability the further you get away from the stream.
And that's right, and that's over land. But if you think of like especially in some of your more linear stream channels, beavers may, because they're such adept swimmers, I mean, they can go miles in either direction of their habitation site on some bodies of water. You know, if it's suitable for travel, they may not like move things from like the furthest reaches of that all the time, but they definitely will cut things, you know, further upstream from where they are and kind of float them back, you know, with the current. So yeah, over land. I think I've seen them go as far as like just under half a mile, and no doubt they'll go further. But within the stream channel or within a reservoir, you know, they can cover some serious ground because they are very serious swimmers.
Yeah, I spooked one once, and it jumped into the pond, and it was really neat to watch it swim underwater trying to hide from me. And he would just sort of just coast down the water stream, and I was like chasing along and watching him. And then he did this flip, and he went down real deep, and I think he stuck on the bottom to wait for me to move on and give me the slip, which he successfully did. But I will say one other anecdote I'll share is I went down with a green light filter on my flashlight one night and saw a beaver right there on the edge of the pond chewing on those spice bush saplings.
That's cool.
And they were not at all. I was amazed how close I was able to get to them, and that the green light filter, probably a red light filter, would work as well. They just almost seemed completely unaware of me. So the wind was probably in my face and in my favor, but I was probably 20, 30 feet from them as they just sat there eating. So
if they're in an area where they're constantly disturbed by people, they'll get pretty sensitive to human sounds or sights. But it sounds like at that site there isn't a lot of pressure on them, and so I actually don't know whether beavers can see in color or not. But I think your experiences would make me think that the answer is probably not. That's cool.
It's not as bright on their
right.
Their eyesight. Yeah,
that's just a really neat experience to have.
Yeah, it was cool. We had one last question, Lou. I thought it likely not. It likely would not account for beaver in streams. Are there any satellite imagery data to estimate beaver populations? Gosh, could you see? I mean, satellite imagery keeps getting better and better. Can we identify beaver ponds from satellite, from the air?
So believe it or not, the answer is yes. In a state like Maryland, where the water channels vary across those 5 physiographic regions, right? It would probably work in portions of the coastal plain, but then like the digital aerial signature would look much different. And like something like a bank den may not even be detectable. So in states that have homogeneous habitat types, like I think that works in some portions of Michigan, perhaps, or Minnesota. But again, specific to habitat types, where you could probably detect dams from imagery or from aerial flyovers. Some states used to conduct aerial flyovers to do either muskrat hut counts or beaver dam counts. But Lou, it's an excellent question. There's this group called BeaverCon that convenes once every 2 years. It's mainly beaver researchers and hydrologists and a lot of advocates, but also some wildlife professionals. That believe it or not, Google people from Google Maps and Google Earth were actually there. With that question, and they were using, to some extent, I believe it was artificial intelligence and computer learning to try to map the answer to that question in select environments. So possible, but in a state like Maryland with as diverse a textured habitat as we have, you run into some additional challenges. So it work in some places, but not in others. But great question. Great
Yeah.
question.
Fascinating. Well, I think we got through most of the questions. There are a few other comments, recommendations, thank yous to you, Joshua. I think we'll
Very,
definitely go
very
over these.
welcome. Happy to be here, and happy to receive any emails or take a couple phone calls if questions remain. But thanks so
Yeah,
much, Luke. I appreciate
and
the
yeah,
offer.
of course. And I will drop if you guys have a chance. We've been running long, but I'm going to pop in the chat a little evaluation survey. Let's see if that hyperlink works. Yes, there's a link that I just popped into the chat, and I think I can put it up on the screen. Maybe. Oh, look at that. I don't know if that'll work for people to click it, but would love to get your feedback. What you liked, how we could improve, other things like that. We're continuing to work on uh, our our technological advancements with this Riverside platform. I know some people do not like it, but it allows us to get really great quality recordings up on YouTube afterwards. So bear with us. We're going to continue to make it better. And thank you all for joining. Love all the people who are doing work for wildlife and for coexistence and managing the problems and creating great habitats through beavers. So thank you, Joshua, and I will sign us off now. Y'all have a great afternoon.